Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition. I'm George Binns, and this is What's Happening in Beverly. And the guest this evening is Jim Modugno. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, George.
And the subject we wanted to talk about this evening is elections, specifically the election of the president and the Electoral College, and where it came from and what's it all about. And I think to set the stage for the discussion, we need to think back a little bit about what was going on at the time in about 1787 when they had the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. There was several problems with them. One is that there was only one representative from each state, and Congress didn't have the power to raise taxes. There was no executive to enforce anything that Congress said. And the worst problem, I guess, that tripped it off was right here in Massachusetts, a thing called Shays Rebellion, that the farmers were upset about excess taxation and the treatment of people by the government of Massachusetts. And the federal government didn't have an army to take on the rebellion. So they started the Constitutional Convention. And one of the things that came out of the convention was that there would be 2 senators from each state. That's easy to do. Then it got to be a little tricky because then they wanted to have representatives in the House of Representatives, and they were to be chosen by population. And it quickly got into the calculation that if they counted the slaves, the South would have excessive power. If, on the other hand, they didn't count the slaves, then the North had controlling power. And this kind of a situation really is not amenable to developing a country. So they did something that we haven't heard about in a heck of a long time. They compromised. And the compromise they settled on was 2/3 of other people. So they came up with a system whereby they could have a representative Congress based on population. And one of the other side features of it that made it attractive to the South was that the taxation was also going to be based on population. So by not counting all of the other people, they got an economic advantage as opposed to a power advantage. So they came up with a system to satisfy both sides, and we got a country out of it. But the other issue comes up, how do we pick a president that represents all the people and is not just a representative of one area? And that's where the Electoral College came in. So how did they do it, Jim?
Well, George, when you think about it, you got to look back, and you can't put our own values of what we know onto people who are putting this together. But they had to come up with a system. I recall that one of the things I would point out in the Federalist Papers, number 68, Hamilton had stated that he thought the founding fathers were afraid of direct election to the presidency. They also didn't want the president to be elected by the Congress, and election of the president by the popular vote of the qualified citizens. They weren't ready for that, I guess, at that moment in time. But they did come up with what they consider to be the Electoral College, and it's, as it's often said, it's not a place; it's just a process. And so one of the key things is that it shows up in a couple of different places in the articles of referring to it. But ultimately today, when we look at it, George, the Electoral College consists of 538 votes, electorals, in other words, votes. The majority of 270 is what it takes to elect a president in the United States. I think most people have kind of grasped onto that. One of the interesting things when you look at what's in that number. It's numbers. You get 2 for the number of senators you have, and you get 1 for every representative you have. Also, the district of DC gets 3 electoral votes, which I overlook that every once in a while. I forget about it, but they have 3, which brings in the question, why should there be a state? Now, anyways, so when you look at that, it's when a lot of people will argue, why can't we have a popular vote? Why can't we just go out there and it's just the vote of the people, right? Whatever the total comes out to be, if I have more than you, George, then I'm elected president. You have more than you're elected president. And so that's kind of goes. And then a lot of times people will look at it and say, I'm voting, but my vote doesn't really count, but it does count. And it's a debatable discussion, and I think it's one the country has been having for good over 200 years, George. So in essence, one of the things that I have always been concerned about myself as an individual is when somebody wins the state, like we'll just use Massachusetts, for example, because we live here. There's 11 electoral votes in Massachusetts. If the president of the United States, who the person who wins the largest number of popular votes in our state, could win by 1 vote, he gets all 11 votes. And so in essence, people sometimes can argue that, Jesus, and I live in the state of Massachusetts, right, like you do, George, and it's very heavily Democrat. And it seems like, my vote doesn't matter, but I go to the polls all the time and I still put my vote in there because I believe it still does matter. And so across the country, George, 48 states have the same concept of winner take all. Only 2 states have what they call a proportional approach to it, and that's Maine, which in 1972 had adopted, and they have 2 senators, obviously, and 2 representatives. So the person who wins the most votes in terms of the election in the state of Maine gets automatically the two votes. But each of the 2 congressional districts where those votes come from, George, if in my district, and I have one and you have the other, my candidate, or just call it candidate B, got more than the person who won overall, we would still get 1 vote that would be contributed towards the candidate that didn't win the popular vote in the state. The only other state that's done that when it's 1992 was Nebraska stepped up and did basically the same thing. They have 5 votes. So the challenge is in this whole thing is when you look at it is, just let me run a number by you. I think I might have shared with this at one point before. There are 9 states and 1 district, being Washington, D.C., what they call the lowest populations in the country. In total, they have only 2.6% of the population. Excuse me. And they only have 33 electoral combined votes. When you look at the top 10 vote getters, they own 54.4% of the population. And they also have a humongous number of over 200 electoral votes in those 10 states, believe it or not. So the argument is that if you didn't have an electoral college that's there now, would anybody go to Wyoming? Would anybody go to Montana, the campaign? Would anybody go to Rhode Island, the campaign? So I think that's some of the narrative that's there in terms of some of the background on this thing. And it's really does it matter? And I think that's the big question that's facing almost everybody, George, is, does our vote matter? And I think the current system we had, let's share some information here. There've been other proposals. So how do you change it? That's the biggest question. How would you change it? So based on the fact that it's in the Constitution, it requires an amendment must be proposed and approved by 2/3 of the House of Congress. So the Senate and the representatives, 2/3, before it could be sent to be ratified by 3/4 or 75% of the states.
Well, the other part of the problem, I think, is that um, the actual process by which the state selects their electors and how they distribute the votes, that's totally within the power of each state. And I think the other thing that's coming out of this is, well, you're mentioning that, yeah, there's some proportional representation in 2 states. I think you mentioned earlier there's like 38 states that are winner take all. There's still some states out there that don't, you haven't described yet. How do they divvy up the electoral votes?
Well, there was actually, George, maybe I misspoke. It was actually 48 states actually
40.
have winners take all.
Okay, so it's all winner take all.
Yeah.
I've seen some buzz on the news off and on that some states are thinking about changing the process of how they select the electors
True.
and how they distribute the votes. So there is a possibility of having a whole bunch of different techniques for selecting the electors. And the question is, are any of them fair?
Well, that's a good question, George. So let me before I answer it directly, let me just kind of give you a little reference and a little background. So over the past 200 years, there have been over 700 different proposals have been introduced to Congress to reform or eliminate the Electoral College. 700 proposals over a 200-year period. Nothing have come about to them. But there are options, right? So the very first option would be just stay with what we have today and what we've had since the beginning of our country. The second one is, and I'll list them off, then we could talk maybe about each one, George, and your thoughts. The second one is the popular voting method. That's the one you hear quite often, where it's just the overall winner takes all, right? Just the most votes, person gets most votes, they're the president of the United States. Kind of straightforward, but not really. The third one is the congressional district approach, and that was what I described a little bit, and you added to it in terms of Maine and Nebraska, right? Their approaches are proportional type of things related to you break it into congressional districts, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, because it has. When I first looked at it, I said I kind of like that a lot, but then when I got into the details, I started not to sour on it, but I started to think there must be another way, right? And then the third one that you want to look at. That was the third, the congressional one. The fourth one is what they called, and we saw it proposed on a ballot, I think the last election, which was referred to as ranked choice voting, right? And that's just, I'll just give you the short version, and we'll talk more about it. The ranked choice voting system allows for voters to list the candidates in the order of their preference on the ballot. So you might have 6 of us running for a position, and they say, I want George in the number 1 slot. I want Billy in number 2, Sally in number 3. My 4th choice is Joe. My last choice is Jim, right? And that's how they would do it. And you can start to think about how, if we have trouble counting ballots today, George, I'm not so sure how we're going to count them when you got ranked choices. And when I explain it a little bit more, it's what I call the system that's the most ripe for corruption, yet they advocate it as being the one that's most representative. And maybe they're right, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, they used that one in New York City recently to go through their primary for mayor, and they're still arguing over who did what to who. And it sounds like a good idea until you try to do it.
Yeah, and I'll just give you one more example if you recall the Iowa caucuses on the Democratic side, they used the forced ranking.
Yeah.
They were, the election was almost over before they came up to decide who had won, right? So I don't think that's and the last one is what is referred to as proportional popular vote. and that system, it's very, very interesting because it's the total number of votes, but the fact of the matter is within a state, if you had 10 million votes and somebody got 9 million and one person got one, you would get 10%, right, of that number would go to one person and 90% to the other, and they would divvy up the electoral vote. So it would be a piggyback onto the electoral college vote. So why don't we go back and just maybe kind of refer to each one of them a little bit, George, and see what we think of each one? So
I think
yes,
before you get into that, the basic issue, I think, is it's the same problem we had, the founding fathers had when they tried to redo the Constitution. You've got things based on population, and yet you get concentrations of populations in various areas. Right now, the East Coast and the West Coast constitute a significant portion of the total population. I don't know what the number is, but it's a big piece of it. And you've got this, what they refer to as the flyover country between the Hudson River and I guess Sacramento. That
correct.
it's a lot of area, and there's a lot of people out there, but they're scattered, and they have a different point of view. And I think this is what the struggle with this kind of a federal government is you've got to come up with some sort of balance between having a 50% plus one tyranny, if you will,
yeah,
and having something that represents everybody's interest.
And it is kind of difficult when you look at it. And the population is, and if you look at it, you talk about it being concentrated in large cities. If you looked at the state of Pennsylvania and you just looked at it and said, okay, they have 20. I believe they have 20 votes that they have. And if you look at it, between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, those two locations represent 80% of the population in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Everything between them is the rural areas.
Yeah. And
they get trumped. They get trumped by the big cities.
Yeah, they get totally ignored. And I think this gets to be a continual problem in not only in the election of the president, but in how do you run a government with different interests. And I think one of the concerns I was reading about this morning is there seems to be some pressure to start dividing up the country into smaller areas that can sort of represent themselves. And then we end up with the same problem we had with the original revolution and forming. Yeah, we can break it up into small pieces, and then we end up with one of these balkanized free-for-alls that somebody's always envious of their neighbor and they want to take them over. And I think we lose the balance of having a very large, diversified country.
And we do, and there's no question about it. And you were right when you point out that the population centers typically have always settled along the coastlines, along the major rivers, the lakes, and so the major lakes like Great Lakes, and then you have the middle of the country, and the values in rural areas as opposed to urban areas, and the requirement are totally different. The requirements that rural people think are important and what people in this urban setting do, they don't always align. And I think that's one of the major problems we have. And even when I look at these systems, and these are basically keep the one we have, and then the other one to get, the other basically four, it's just, there's no clear winner in them. You could argue every point of them has a positive and some negatives. And, when you look at the popular vote, it's easy to say that, but does it really represent the country when you look at it and you say that 10 states have the largest populations, 54.4% of the population is situated in 10 states. Therefore, if I was a presidential candidate, I would be spending just about 80% of my time in those 10 states.
Yeah. And who's he going to represent when he's in power? Exactly that. And what happens to the other 50% of the population?
The worst condition you can find yourself in is when you think your vote doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
And I think at times when you look at systems and you look at even the last election, and we don't want to debate this, but the last election in 2020, I mean, when you look at the whole total system in general, there's a lot of people who didn't think elections were conducted fairly. That's one of the biggest problems facing our nation. That could be a topic to another discussion. But when it comes down to the method of how we deal with electoral college votes, it still matters to have the big states. The big states have most of the voting, right? Because you got 2 senators and you get all your representatives.
Yeah.
Now, California is going to lose, I think, 3 House seats going forward because of population loss. And they'll be picked up by Texas or Florida. But there's no guarantee that a Florida or a Texas are a more conservative or a less conservative, or, in comparison to like California, we know tends to be a little bit liberal. So the populations will move over time, and the electoral college kind of has the ability to flow with that. So one could say you could argue and say it's a little bit of a plus. The other part of the electoral college that I found interest in doing the research, George, is that they felt strongly that a number of the scholars that it presented electoral college provided almost like a firewall for fraud. And again, what they were talking about, I'm sure, is they were talking about in their system, a small number of fraudulent votes has no impact against it. However, I think I would argue that today, right? But that was the rationale between there. But one of the things they think it can prevent systematic fraudulent voting across multiple states. I think they probably should rethink their thinking on those areas.
Yeah, the free-for-all is still going on, with Pennsylvania starting to recount, and Arizona going into an ongoing recount.
Even Wisconsin's now wants to do
agree on what they recounted.
Yeah.
And it's a messy system right now, and it's going to be an ongoing battle to try to sort this mess out. And it gets to be partisan.
And I think if it was, like we talked about, if it was just the popular vote, I think the amount of tension that it creates in the country, people say the electoral college, if they went to just a sheer population, the amount of tension in the country would grow.
Yeah.
It would grow even more.
And the basic problem we're in right now is that the country is being balkanized, breaking down into all sorts of different factions, and nobody can agree with anything. And there's that little snide remark I put in the beginning of back in the days of the founding fathers, they had a process that we have lost called compromise, and it just comes down to that's what the essence of the 3/5 other people comes down to, is that I don't like your system of counting all the slaves, and the North says, I don't like your system not counting any of them. And
Right.
they had to agree on something and get the country going, and they did, and they compromised. And that's the thing I think that's been lost, and I think that's the lesson you need to take out of a discussion or research into the Electoral College. It's an example of, I don't get everything I want, you don't get everything you want, but we get something we both need. And it worked.
Right. And you got to, and I think that compromise is a key element. I mean, you're right. Today, it doesn't appear to be very prevalent in what we do. And the other thing is, I don't think our founding fathers ever envisioned that they would have career politicians,
Yeah,
right? At all levels, the federal government, the state level, and the local government. I don't think they envisioned that at all. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if they could have ever envisioned that. But it's become a, when you have career anybody, it becomes a power play.
yeah,
Right. So compromise is about sharing and doing what's best for the people of the United States. Unfortunately, I think when compromise is put on the table, people think of it as a power. I'm losing some power, or I want more power. And that's, you know, if power is the name of the game, compromise doesn't work for either party,
yeah.
any group of people. And it's kind of unfortunate. And, you know, but I really did, when I was looking at this thing, the ranked choice voting, which came up on the ballot in Massachusetts, we could select it. And fortunately, I think the people made the right choice to reject it. It absolutely is a system, in my opinion, that's probably the most corrupt approach to doing voting.
Well, the way you describe it, it's an absolute morass. Once you get into it, you have no idea what you're doing. And as you pointed out, the caucus in Iowa was still thrashing over how to count these votes, and the president was elected. You know, that's the other half of the game, especially in this day and age of instant television and Facebook and Twitter and all that. You got to have an answer right away, or the conspiracy theories start, and that is equally disingenuous.
Yeah, you can't have weeks or even months of that. That would bring you almost back to almost like, you know, parliamentary type system that you see oftentimes in Europe, and that doesn't work all that well either at times.
No, England is going through this right now with who's in control of the COVID lockdown and procedures. That's
correct.
So one of these examples. But anyway, we've had a half hour worth of fun, and
we have.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks again, Jim, for doing all the research and bringing all this to our attention. And ladies and gentlemen, as I say every time, my email address will show up in the credits. And if you've got an opinion you'd like to express on what's happening, send me an email and we'll make it happen. And again, thanks for joining us this evening, and have fun. Good night, all.